The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, The Courage to Repair. When we don't see eye to eye, welcome back to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, at the space where we strip away the polite scripts, sit with the messy truths, and talk about the parts of being human that most people avoid. Today, we're stepping into the territory we often fear most, conflict. Not the kind that explodes in obvious ways, but the quiet, uncomfortable tension that arises when values clash, when desires pull us in different directions, or when a disagreement makes us question the stability of a bond. In everyday life, these moments show up everywhere, in friendships, partnerships, family ties, and work relationships. We'll explore what happens when the connection is strained, the fear of rejection that can keep us silent, and the courage it takes to repair rather than retreat. This isn't about pretending every conflict can be neatly tied up with a bow. It's about learning how to meet it with presence, honesty, and enough self-trust to know when to rebuild and when to let go. So let's begin the shift that starts the storm. It often starts with something small, a comment, a decision, a passing remark, and suddenly the air between you changes. You're still in the same conversation, but it's as if the room tilts. In that moment, the relationship is no longer about what's being said, but about what's at stake. The first crack in the glass. The earliest sign of conflict isn't always loud or dramatic. It's often a subtle shift that leaves both people feeling slightly off balance. This is the moment when unspoken fears, past hurts, and unaligned values quietly begin shaping the outcome of the conversation. Attributes, subtle energy shifts, micro moments of disconnection, emotional tension before words escalate. This section explores how seemingly small moments can become turning points. We'll look at the body's instinctive reading of social signals, the tendency to fill in the gaps with assumptions, and how these early shifts often set the tone for whether the bond is healed or harmed. Synchronization to disconnection. Imagine sitting across from a close friend at a cafe. You've been laughing, swapping stories, and feeling in sync. Then they mention something that clashes with a deeply held value of yours. Perhaps it's about politics, a family matter, or a choice you'd never make. You respond lightly, maybe with a question, but you feel their shoulders tighten, their eye contact flicker. The noise of the cafe fades as your mind zones in on that shift. It's not a full-blown disagreement yet, but suddenly you're more aware of what you say, of how they might react, of the potential ripple effects. These moments, the first crack in the glass, carry enormous weight because they're where the mind decides, this is safe, this is dangerous. The decision is often unconscious, rooted in experiences far older than the current conversation. Personal reflection, I've lived through this shift countless times, in different contexts. In one friendship, it came when I mentioned a belief about health that clashed with theirs. The warmth in the conversation cooled almost instantly. We continued talking, but something in my chest tightened. I was measuring every word. In my family, it happened around the dinner table when I challenged an unspoken tradition. The conversation didn't explode, but the silence afterwards said more than words could. In my creative work, it showed up when collaborating on a project. A teammate dismissed an idea I felt strongly about. It wasn't the disagreement that hurt. It was the subtle withdrawal in their tone afterwards, as if my contribution had shifted how they saw me. Over time, I realized my fear in these moments wasn't about the disagreement itself, but about what it might lead to: loss of closeness, rejection, or the slow erosion of trust. Those small cracks have always felt like warnings of something bigger, and for years, my instinct was to patch over them quickly, often at the cost of my truth. Psychological insight research in interpersonal communication shows that humans are acutely sensitive to microsignals. Small behavioral cues like shifts in body posture, facial expression, and vocal tone. Burgoon, Guerrero and Floyd, Nonverbal Communication, 2016. These signals are processed rapidly by the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, which is why even minor changes in social energy can trigger unease before we consciously register why. From an attachment theory perspective, Bowlby, 1969, the first crack moment is a potential attachment threat, a cue that the relationship's security may be in question. Those with anxious attachment styles may react quickly to repair or overcompensate, while avoidance styles may pull away to preserve autonomy. It's also worth noting the concept of the fundamental attribution error, a human tendency to interpret others' behavior as a reflection of their character rather than their situation. Ross, 1977. In these subtle moments, we may jump to conclusions. They don't respect me, rather than they're processing what I said. Insight prompt: think about the last time you sensed an early shift in a conversation. What story did you immediately start telling yourself about why it happened? Theory in action. Next time you feel the air change, pause before reacting. Name the sensation. I feel tension in my chest without assigning a reason yet. This interrupts the brain's tendency to leap into defensive narratives and gives space for curiosity rather than assumption. The collision of values. It's one thing to disagree on surface level preferences, like what film to watch or where to eat, but it's another to bump up against core values. These aren't just opinions, they're the anchors we've built our lives around. When someone we care about challenges us, it can feel like they're questioning us at our very foundation. When worlds don't align, value clashes go deeper than simple disagreements, because they touch on identity, moral frameworks, and our vision of what matters most. These moments can trigger defensiveness, fear of incompatibility, or the urge to convince the other person to see things the right way, our way. Attributes core belief conflicts, identity-based disagreements, emotional stakes in everyday conversations. This section examines how value collisions affect our sense of safety and belonging. We explore why disagreements rooted in identity can feel threatening, how our nervous system interprets them as social danger, and why the stakes feel so high even in everyday interactions. Mutual trust breakdown. Picture this. You're in conversation with a colleague you respect. You've always clicked on humor, work ethic, and even a few shared hobbies. Then the topic of parenting comes up, and they casually express a belief that completely opposes your own. It's not said with malice, but you feel a flash of heat in your chest. Your mind begins to assemble arguments before they've even finished their sentence. These moments are like tectonic plates grinding, invisible to the casual observer, but powerful enough to cause deep shifts in the relationship. Value clashes threaten not just agreement, but mutual trust, the belief that you share a common moral ground. And when that ground feels shaky, it's easy to fall into one of two traps: self-censorship to preserve harmony, or aggressive persuasion to restore it. Neither approach allows for genuine connection. One erases your voice, the other erodes theirs. The courage is in learning to stay at the table without collapsing into either. Personal reflection. I've felt this with friends whose political views suddenly revealed a chasm between us. At first, I tried to keep the peace, nodding, changing the subject, but I'd leave those conversations feeling hollow, as if I'd betrayed myself in the process. In another case, I went the opposite route. I pushed hard to prove my point in the moment. I wasn't yelling, but my words had an edge I couldn't disguise. The conversation became a battleground. Days later, I realized I hadn't been fighting for understanding. I'd been fighting to avoid the discomfort of disconnection. Even in smaller situations, like disagreements over lifestyle choices, I noticed the same pattern. My body would register the clash as a threat, my chest would tighten, and my mind would rush into self-protection mode. Over the years, I've learned that the tension isn't just about the issue, it's about what the issue represents. Disagreeing on values can feel like disagreeing on whether the bond itself is viable. Psychological insight. Social psychology has long recognized that values are tied to self-concept, the collection of beliefs we hold about who we are, Rokeach, and 1973. When those values are challenged, the brain often interprets it as a personal attack, activating the fight or flight response even in non-physical situations. Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations Theory, 2004, explains how people prioritize different moral pillars, such as care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity, to varying degrees. Value clashes often occur not because one person lacks morals, but because they're weighing these foundations differently. Additionally, reactive devaluation can distort these interactions. The tendency to dismiss an idea simply because it comes from someone we perceive as opposed to us Stillinger et al., 1991. In close relationships, this means we may reject a loved one's view not on merit, but because accepting it feels like betraying our own identity. Insight prompt. Think of a time when someone you cared about expressed a value you strongly disagreed with. Did you respond to the content of their view, or to what it felt like view meant about them and your relationship? Theory in action. When you feel your values clashing with someone else's, pause and silently ask, which moral foundation are they prioritizing here? Even if you disagree, identifying the underlying principle creates a bridge for empathy and reduces the urge to react defensively. The shadow of rejection underneath many conflicts, there's a quieter fear that disagreement won't just cause tension, it will cost us the relationship altogether. It's the fear that speaking our truth might make us unlovable, or that seeing someone else's truth might make them unreachable. The fear beneath the fight conflict isn't always about the surface issue. Often, it's about the risk of loss. When we believe disagreement threatens belonging, we can become either overly compliant to avoid rejection or overly combative to secure our place through dominance. Attributes rejection sensitivity, belonging versus authenticity dilemma defensive overcompensation. This section looks at how the fear of relational loss influences our behavior in disagreements, the tension between self-expression and connection, and how defensive strategies, even well-meaning ones, can backfire. Simulating scenarios. Imagine you've been dating someone for a few months. You've clicked on so many levels, and you're starting to imagine a future together. Then, one evening, you discover a big lifestyle choice they'd never mentioned, one that conflicts with your own deeply held preference. Suddenly, your mind isn't just processing the information, it's simulating the relationship ending. Every silence in the conversation feels like a step closer to the door. The topic itself might be solvable, but your nervous system is telling you this is a cliff edge. Fear of rejection has a way of collapsing our options. It can make us swallow words we should speak, or weaponize words we should soften. And when both people are carrying that fear, they can end up in a standoff, each convinced the other is already halfway out the door. Personal reflection. I've been here more times than I'd like to admit. I can think of one close friendship where a single disagreement about a social issue sent me spiraling into overthinking. For days I avoided calling them, convinced that the silence meant they'd written me off. In hindsight, they hadn't even been upset, they just needed space to process. But my history with sudden relational loss had primed me to see distance as abandonment. On the flip side, I've also been the one pulling away. Once, in a partnership, I caught myself disengaging after a disagreement, not because I wanted out, but because the discomfort of feeling misunderstood triggered my retreat reflex. It was only after reflecting on that pattern that I saw the irony. Both of us feared rejection so much that we created the very distance we were afraid of. Psychological insight, the concept of rejection sensitivity, Downey and Feldman, 1996, explains why some people are hyper-alert to signs of possible rejection. This heightened sensitivity can lead to perceiving rejection where none exists, often resulting in preemptive withdrawal or defensive overreaction. Attachment theory also sheds light here. People with anxious attachment styles tend to over-monitor for signs of disconnection, while avoidant styles may downplay or disengage to protect themselves. Bowlby, 1969, Hazan and Shaver, 1987. Interestingly, self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan, 2000, points out that humans have three core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Conflict can threaten relatedness, but sacrificing autonomy to preserve it leads to inauthenticity, a long-term strain on any relationship. Insight prompt. Think of a disagreement where your real fear wasn't about the topic, but about losing the person. How did that fear shape your response? Theory in action. In your next disagreement, try naming the process rather than the position. Instead of debating the topic immediately, you might say, I'm noticing I feel worried that this could push us apart. This shifts the focus from winning the point to protecting the bond. The art of the repair. Every disagreement has two conversations running at once, the one about the topic and the one about the relationship. Repair isn't just about solving the problem. It's about tending to the connection so it can hold more than just harmony. From fracture to flow repair is the process of reconnecting after disconnection, of re-establishing safety while keeping authenticity intact. It's about creating a bridge between two different experiences without forcing them into sameness. Attributes: active reconnection, mutual acknowledgement, relational safety net. This section explores how intentional repair keeps relationships from becoming brittle, how empathy and clarity work together, and why repair often matters more than the original disagreement. Realignment: picture this. A heated discussion has just ended in silence. You both walk away, each carrying your version of the story. Hours later, you're still replaying the conversation in your head, adjusting lines, imagining what you should have said. Then comes the turning point. One of you reaches out, not to restart the argument, but to name the rupture. Maybe it's as simple as "that got tense, and I want us to be okay." Repair is rarely about winning an argument. It's about signaling that the bond matters more than the moment of disconnection. It's an invitation to step back into trust, even if the topic itself still sits unresolved. Personal reflection. Some of the most important connections in my life survived not because we avoided conflict, but because we learned how to repair. I remember a creative partnership that almost fell apart over a project direction. We were both stubborn, both convinced our way was the right way. After a week of strained silence, I reached out and admitted my part in escalating things. That simple act didn't just save the collaboration, it deepened it. We started working differently after that, checking in sooner, naming tensions before they became fractures. There have been other times when I didn't repair, times when pride or fear of rejection kept me quiet. In those cases, the silence grew roots and the connection faded. Those are the ones I look back on with a mix of sadness and humility. They remind me that repair is a choice, but also a skill, one I'm still learning. Ecological Insight: John Gottman's research on relationship stability, 1994, highlights that successful couples aren't free from conflict. They excel at repair attempts. Gottman found that the ability to make and receive repair bids is one of the strongest predictors of long-term relational satisfaction. Repair often includes elements of empathic validation, naming the other person's feelings without necessarily agreeing with their perspective, and responsibility taking, owning your role without diminishing theirs. From a neuroscience standpoint, repair helps co-regulate the nervous system. Through calm tone, non-defensive posture, and empathetic listening, both parties' physiological stress responses can shift from fight-flight back to a state of social engagement. Porges, 2011, Polyvagal Theory. Insight prompt. Think about the last time you repaired after a disagreement. What specific words or actions made it possible to reconnect? Theory in action. After a rupture, reach out within 24 hours with a simple repair bid. Keep it short, human, and non-defensive. "That got heated. I care about you, and I'd like to work through it." The goal isn't to solve everything instantly, but to reopen the door. When we still disagree, some conflicts don't end with a neat bow. You can talk it through, listen deeply, and still walk away holding different values, desires, or beliefs. The question then becomes, can the bond survive without the agreement? Respect without resolution. Not every conflict will be fixed. True relational maturity lies in the ability to accept difference without diminishing connection. This is the art of holding respect even when common ground is limited. Attributes: coexistence with difference, emotional detachment from winning, sustained mutual regard. This section explores what it means to live alongside unresolved differences, the boundaries that make it possible, and the emotional skills required to resist turning disagreement into disconnection. The cycle: imagine you've been through the full cycle, the disagreement, the cooling off period, and the attempt to repair. You've clarified what matters to you, heard what matters to them, and yet, how you're still not aligned. It can feel like a failure, especially if you've grown up believing that good relationships mean thinking the same way. But sometimes the measure of strength isn't in the resolution, it's in the respect that remains despite its absence. There's a quiet confidence in being able to sit with someone, knowing you see the world differently, but also knowing the bond isn't contingent on sameness. Personal reflection: I've lost relationships because I thought agreement was the only way to maintain closeness. If we didn't see eye to eye, I'd keep pushing, not always with aggression, but with that subtle insistence that the conversation wasn't over until they came around to my side. Over time, I realized this wasn't connection. It was control wearing the clothes of understanding. Now, some of my most valued relationships exist in the space between difference and acceptance. I have friends whose politics I disagree with, family members whose lifestyle choices I wouldn't adopt, and colleagues who approach creative work in ways I wouldn't choose. And yet, we've built a kind of mutual respect that makes our connection richer, not poorer. It's not that the differences disappear, it's that they stop being the deciding factor for whether the relationship survives. Psychological insight social psychologist Milton Rokeach's work on belief systems, 1960, shows that values and core beliefs are deeply embedded in identity. When challenged, the brain's defensive systems activate, often leading to belief perseverance, and the tendency to cling to existing beliefs even in the face of contradictory evidence. Accepting persistent differences requires a shift from ego involvement, where disagreement feels like a personal attack, to issue involvement, where disagreement is simply about the topic. This shift preserves the relationship by separating identity from the argument. Culturally, this is supported by concepts like agree to disagree, a phrase that, while sometimes used dismissively, represents an important relational boundary. Neurologically, sustained disagreement without escalation relies on emotional regulation skills that keep the amygdala from hijacking the prefrontal cortex's reasoning ability. Do, 1998. Insight prompt. Where in your life are you holding onto a relationship despite fundamental differences? What allows it to work? Theory in action. When you recognize an impasse, explicitly name the shared values that do unite you. For example, we see this differently, but I value how much you care about the outcome. This reinforces the bond without erasing the difference. Rebuilding trust after the storm. Once the argument fades and the words have stopped echoing, there's a quieter question that lingers. Can I trust you again? Trust isn't restored by simply agreeing to move on. It's rebuilt brick by brick through consistent action that signals safety again. The slow architecture of repair trust is not a single promise. It's the accumulation of small, consistent moments that tell both people it's safe to lean in again. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to be uncomfortable without rushing the process. Attributes incremental reassurance, emotional predictability, safety through consistency. This section explores how to create an environment where trust can regrow after it's been damaged, and why pacing is as important as intent in the repair process. Nurturing fragile grounds picture two people after a storm. The skies have cleared, but the ground is still soggy. You can't run across it without slipping. That's what post-conflict trust feels like. Fragile terrain where too much speed can undo the stability you're trying to rebuild. Rebuilding trust isn't about grand gestures. It's about keeping the small promises, showing up when you said you would, following through on the ordinary things, listening without defensiveness when tension flickers again. Think of it less like flipping a switch and more like tending a garden. The seeds don't sprout because you stare at them. They grow because you keep showing up with water, sunlight, and time. Personal reflection. I've been on both ends of this process. I've been the one asking for trust back, eager for instant forgiveness so we could get back to normal. But when I rushed it, I wasn't rebuilding trust. I was just trying to escape my discomfort. I've also been the one struggling to give trust again, even when the other person seemed sincere. Sometimes it wasn't their words I doubted, but whether I could risk my heart in the same way again. What I've learned is that trust rarely returns on a deadline. In one friendship, it took months of ordinary, uneventful interactions before the sense of ease returned. No single conversation fixed it. It was the repetition of showing up with steadiness that made it possible to believe in the relationship again. Psychological Insight Research on Trust Repair by Kim Dirks and Cooper, 2009, highlights that rebuilding trust after a violation involves two primary strategies: apology-based repair, addressing the emotional harm, and denial-based repair, asserting the harm wasn't intentional or due to negligence. While apologies are vital, behavioral evidence over time carries more weight. Neuroscientifically, trust repair is tied to the brain's reward system. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, increases when we experience consistent, safe interactions, gradually reducing the amygdala's fear signals. This is why repeated small acts matter more than grand reconciliations. The nervous system needs multiple exposures to safety before lowering its guard. Insight prompt. When trust was broken in your life, what small, consistent actions made you feel safe again or would have if they'd been offered? Theory in action after conflict. Create a micro-trust plan. List 3 small commitments you can make and keep in the next 2 weeks. These should be realistic, repeatable, and observable by the other person. Choosing the future of the bond, not every conflict ends with the relationship intact. Some bonds survive and even strengthen after repair. Others fade or transform into something entirely different. The real courage is in making that choice with clarity, not out of habit, fear, or guilt. The crossroads after resolution. When the storm has passed, you stand at a decision point. Do we continue together or do we part in peace? This isn't a question to answer in the heat of hurt, but in the calm that follows honest repair work. The choice shapes not just the relationship, but also how you carry yourself forward. Attributes deliberate decision-making, emotional closure, redefining the relationship. This section looks at how to evaluate whether a relationship has the foundation to continue and how to let go without resentment when it doesn't. What comes next? Imagine you've rebuilt part of a bridge after a collapse. It's functional enough to walk across, but should you? Sometimes the effort to repair reveals that the bridge was never meant to hold the weight you were putting on it. Other times, you realize the structure is stronger now than before. Choosing the future of a relationship isn't about keeping score of who hurt who more. It's about asking whether both people can sustain a healthy, respectful connection going forward. The most dangerous choice is the passive one, drifting back into old patterns without deciding at all. In that space, unspoken resentments can grow, making the next rupture even harder to repair. Personal reflection I've held on too long before, convincing myself that history alone was enough reason to keep someone in my life. In reality, I was afraid of the grief that would come if I let go. I've also ended relationships after repair, not because the other person was bad, but because I realized the connection was built on a version of myself I no longer was. One friendship ended after we'd navigated a big argument, and though we forgave each other, I felt a quiet truth. The bond had served its season. And then there are the bonds I chose to keep, where repair didn't just restore what we had, but opened up a deeper honesty we'd never reached before. In those cases, the decision to stay wasn't just about love or loyalty. It was about shared willingness to keep doing the work. Psychological insight relationship researchers like John Gottman and Julie Schwartz Gottman emphasize that post-conflict decisions should weigh 2 key factors: trust and commitment. Trust answers, do I believe you have my best interests at heart? Commitment answers, am I willing to work through future difficulties with you? From a behavioral standpoint, sunk cost fallacy can keep people in relationships long after they've stopped being healthy. This cognitive bias makes us overvalue the time, energy, or resources already invested, even when continuing causes harm. Recognizing this bias allows for clearer decision-making. Letting go doesn't have to mean failure. In systems theory, our relationships are dynamic systems that sometimes evolve by separating, so each part can grow independently. Insight prompt. Looking at your relationships, which ones have you kept purely because of history, and which ones have you kept because they still actively add to your life? Theory in action after major repairs. Set a check-in point, a week, a month, or 3 months later, to consciously evaluate whether the bond still feels worth the investment for both of you. Where this leaves us, conflict doesn't have to be the death of connection. Sometimes it's the very thing that makes it stronger, if we are willing to stay in the discomfort long enough to listen, to own our part, and to let repair reshape the bond. But repair is also a choice. It's not about forcing a return to how things were, but deciding together what the relationship can realistically be going forward. That's the real courage to choose with clarity, even when the choice hurts. Your worth isn't measured by whether every bond survives, but by how honestly you show up in the ones that do. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and let it breathe. And remember, the courage to repair begins with the courage to face what's real. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, the Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, the Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of the Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching This Place Called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within traces food frequency and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.